There are stories that haunt hospitals, whispers that slip down fluorescent-lit corridors long after midnight, when nurses exchange uneasy glances and the air tastes faintly of fear. But on the night of February 19, 1994, inside Riverside General Hospital, California, the horror was not a rumor. It was real, chemical, and it seeped through the skin. Imagine standing in the emergency room, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, as paramedics wheel in a young woman barely 30, skin slick with sweat, eyes darting between confusion and terror. She's just a regular patient, or so everyone thinks. But as doctors draw her blood, a sharp, ammonia-like odor fills the room, the air warping with something no one can name. Suddenly, the healers become the harmed nurses faint, doctors collapse, and panic swells like a toxic tide. What happened to Gloria Ramirez? And why did her body become a mystery that would terrify science and medicine for years? Some called her the Toxic Lady, but in the chaos that night, she was just Gloria terrified, fighting for breath as everyone around her scrambled to survive. If stories like this send chills down your spine and make you question what's truly possible, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us as we unravel the real-life medical mystery of Gloria Ramirez. If you've ever wondered what it's like when the ordinary turns unexplainably sinister, drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were there? Let's get into it. It was the kind of night when every second felt like it stretched longer than it should, where the air seemed to thicken with the quiet tension that always surrounds a hospital in the dead of night. February 19, 1994 was no different at Riverside General Hospital, a place typically full of routine emergency calls. But tonight, the walls would witness a medical mystery so bizarre, so chilling, it would remain unsolved for years to come. Gloria Ramirez, a woman in her early 30s, was rushed to the emergency room with a troubling list of symptoms: vomiting, confusion, and breathing difficulty. What seemed like an ordinary case of acute respiratory distress would soon spiral into a nightmare that not only shocked the medical staff, but also left them fighting for their lives. As Gloria was wheeled into the ER, her skin was a strange shade, almost oily, a slick sheen covering her body. It was a symptom doctors had seen before in cases of acute illness, but nothing could prepare them for what happened next. As the paramedics moved swiftly, attempting to stabilize her, the hospital staff started noticing something strange, something that couldn't be ignored. A pungent, ammonia-like odor began to fill the room. No one could immediately identify it. Was it chemical? Was it an infection? But it wasn't just the smell that was concerning. The nurses felt dizzy, lightheaded, and some of them even began to faint as if overcome by an invisible force. Dr. Thomas Richards, one of the doctors, was quick to assess the situation. His team worked to stabilize Gloria, but something was off. When the first blood sample was taken, it didn't look right. There was a strange, cloudy appearance to it, a thick, oily residue floating on the surface. And then came the unmistakable realization. This wasn't just any ordinary emergency. This was something far more dangerous, something they had never encountered before. Within minutes, the ER staff found themselves succumbing to the same symptoms. The nurses felt their legs weaken, their vision blurring. A few of them staggered out of the room, gasping for air, while others collapsed onto the floor, unconscious. Dr. Richards was forced to abandon the effort to examine Gloria, further as he too was overcome by dizziness and nausea. By then, the emergency room had turned into a battlefield medics, and doctors were scrambling to hold on to their composure while trying to save Gloria's life. But it was as if the very air around them was becoming toxic. But it wasn't just the immediate physical symptoms that made this case so mysterious. Gloria's condition seemed to defy explanation. She wasn't just sick. Her blood was showing signs of an unknown, possibly toxic substance, something that could affect not only her, but everyone in proximity. Gloria was, in fact, slowly poisoning everyone around her. And yet there was no obvious cause, no obvious sign of trauma or illness that could have triggered such a cascade of health crises. As the situation escalated, hospital staff took action, sealing off the EA and moving Gloria into isolation. Meanwhile, medical teams frantically tried to figure out what had caused this bizarre outbreak of symptoms. Was it some kind of infectious disease? A chemical exposure? The questions mounted, but the answers were nowhere to be found. Medical experts would later speculate about the possibility of poisoning, but the truth remained elusive. Dr. Richards, still reeling from his symptoms, ordered a full examination of the air in the area. Environmental hazard teams were called in, and samples of the air were taken for testing. But as the minutes turned into hours, the medical team could do little more than watch in horror as the situation unfolded. The smell of ammonia still lingered in the air, a silent, invisible killer creeping through the hallways of the hospital. In the coming hours, the authorities would also get involved. Police, hazmat teams, and emergency medical teams flooded the scene to try and uncover what had gone wrong. What was happening in that room? Was it a case of accidental poisoning? Was there some kind of industrial leak? Theories swirled around the hospital, but nobody had an answer, at least not yet. By the time the crisis had passed and Gloria was eventually transported to another hospital, the damage had already been done. Several medical staff had collapsed and required treatment. 3 of them were hospitalized, including Dr. Richards, who was left with lingering symptoms of dizziness and fatigue. The mystery of what had happened that night became the talk of the medical world, but no one could truly explain it. Even as authorities combed through Gloria's medical history, there was no indication that she had come into contact with any chemicals, toxins, or materials that could explain the chaos. As days passed, Gloria's condition worsened. She went into renal failure, and after weeks of fighting for her life, she ultimately succumbed to her illness. But her death would not be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of a mystery that continues to baffle doctors and scientists to this day. What had happened to Gloria Ramirez? What had caused her to become the vessel of poison that not only harmed her, but nearly killed everyone in the room that night? Some say it was the result of a strange medical condition. Others argue that it was a case of foul play and intentional poisoning gone wrong. Still, there's a possibility that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, hidden in the toxic air that filled the room that night. But one thing is certain: the mystery of Gloria Ramirez, the woman who poisoned her doctors, would leave its mark on medical history for decades to come. The initial aftermath of that fateful night in Riverside General Hospital left a lingering sense of unease in the air, as if a storm had passed, but the winds had not yet calmed. Medical professionals, who had once felt confident in their ability to face the unpredictable, now found themselves questioning the very nature of the work they had devoted their lives to. How could a simple emergency case morph into a catastrophic event? For weeks after Gloria Ramirez's death, there was no resolution, only more questions, endless speculation, and theories that grew darker by the day. The more the authorities dug into the incident, the more they realized just how little they knew. Gloria had been a 31-year-old woman from Riverside, with no significant medical history, nothing that would have suggested she was carrying a deadly contagion, nor any sign of trauma that might have led to her rapid decline. Her family was devastated by the unexpected tragedy, but what haunted them more than her death was the uncertainty of the cause. It wasn't just Gloria who had suffered. Many who had come into contact with her were affected in ways they couldn't understand. How could someone's presence in a room cause a chemical-like reaction that sent medical professionals to the hospital in critical condition? Medical examiners launched a thorough investigation, but even the most experienced pathologists were at a loss. The toxicology reports came back clear. There were no obvious signs of drugs, poisons, or alcohol in Gloria's system. Nothing that would explain the strange symptoms that had taken over both her body and the hospital room. In fact, Her blood had shown a bizarre, oily appearance, a chemical compound that no one could identify. But this wasn't the first time something mysterious had happened at Riverside General. Over the years, the hospital had been the site of several cases that seemed to defy the usual boundaries of medical science. But this was something altogether different, a phenomenon that many could not bring themselves to explain. As the weeks turned into months, rumors about the cause of Gloria's illness began to circulate. Some said it was a case of heavy metal poisoning. Perhaps something from a nearby industrial facility had leaked into the environment. Others speculated that the hospital's air filtration system had malfunctioned, spewing out toxic chemicals into the air. But the evidence didn't match these theories. Environmental tests showed that the air had been clear. There was no trace of any hazardous chemicals, no evidence of contamination in the hospital's water or ventilation systems. Then another theory emerged. What if it wasn't the environment at all? What if it was Gloria herself? What if the very toxins within her body had triggered a chemical reaction so powerful that it overwhelmed everyone around her? It was a theory that seemed far-fetched, but the more experts considered it, the more it seemed plausible. Could Gloria have somehow absorbed or been exposed to a substance that turned her into a walking weapon, her own body acting as a conduit for a toxic chemical reaction? And if so, how? Medical experts who had examined Gloria's case began to look into rare condition syndromes that could cause severe chemical imbalances in the body, making the blood take on strange properties. But none of the conditions they investigated seemed to fully explain the unusual sequence of events. It was as though Gloria's case didn't fit neatly into any existing medical framework. It was around this time that a breakthrough came, sort of. A physician in Los Angeles named Dr. Michael D. Smith, a specialist in toxicology, came across a study of a rare condition known as dimethyl mercury poisoning. Dimethyl mercury is a highly toxic substance, and exposure to even small amounts of it could cause neurological and physical deterioration. It was a long shot, but the symptoms seemed to match, and the chemical residue in Gloria's blood seemed similar to what could be produced by the presence of mercury in the body. But how could Gloria have been exposed to something like that? The hospital staff had no reason to believe she had been in contact with any dangerous chemicals, let alone dimethyl mercury. The theory began to gain traction, but there was still no clear evidence linking Gloria's case to such an exotic and dangerous substance. The more time passed, the more the story of the toxic lady, as the press had dubbed her, began to captivate the public. Gloria Ramirez became a figure of both sympathy and suspicion, an enigma that had left an indelible mark on everyone who had been involved with her. How could someone so ordinary, so seemingly healthy, trigger such an extraordinary event? The more people looked into her life, the more oddities surfaced. She had been known to suffer from various medical issues, including severe pain and fatigue, but nothing that would have suggested she was in a position to be carrying something so dangerous. Her family, meanwhile, was in shock. They could hardly believe that their daughter, their sister, had caused such devastation. Gloria's brother, Miguel, spoke to the press and described how she had always been healthy despite her occasional complaints of pain. He expressed disbelief that she could have been carrying something so dangerous and insisted that there had been no indication of foul play. But as rumors continued to spread, it became more and more difficult to separate fact from fiction. Was it an accidental exposure? Was it something more sinister? It was clear that the mystery of Gloria Ramirez would not be easily solved. As the months passed, investigators and medical professionals alike struggled to find an answer. But with each dead end, the mystery only deepened. And as the case remained unsolved, the story began to take on an almost mythical quality, as if Gloria had become a symbol of the unknown dangers lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. In Riverside, life slowly returned to normal. The hospital eventually recovered from the shock of that night, though it would never be the same. Doctors and nurses who had witnessed the horrors of that night would never forget the strange, toxic atmosphere that had overwhelmed them. The very air in the emergency room seemed to hold a lingering tension, as though it too had been tainted by the events of that night. And yet, even after all the tests, all the theories, no one truly understood what had happened. Gloria's death, while tragic, was only the beginning of a mystery that would haunt those who were closest to it for years to come. Some believed that the answers would eventually emerge, that science would eventually catch up with the strange events of that night. Others thought that the truth might never be known, that the bizarre death of Gloria Ramirez would remain one of those inexplicable moments in history, a chapter that no one could fully explain. In the years that followed, Gloria's case would remain unsolved, and the mystery surrounding the toxic lady would continue to haunt the medical community. But one thing was clear: whatever had happened that night was no ordinary event. It was an incident that blurred the line between science and the supernatural, a case that seemed to defy reason. Some say that the answers will one day be found, while others insist that there are some mysteries too strange to ever fully solve. As Gloria Ramirez's case continued to reverberate through the medical community, it began to take on a life of its own, growing into a cautionary tale that haunted the corridors of hospitals across the country. No longer was it just about Gloria. The toxic lady had become a symbol of something more. It was the unknown, the invisible dangers that could lurk in the most unexpected places. No one could pinpoint exactly what had caused the strange reactions that night, but everyone involved could sense that something deeply unsettling had occurred. In the following months, the hospital staff continued to recover physically, but emotionally, the scars would remain. They had become part of something that science couldn't explain, a situation that defied logic, and no amount of medical expertise could change that. Soon after the incident, Riverside General Hospital received an influx of investigators, researchers, and journalists, all eager to uncover the truth. The story of the toxic lady captivated the public in ways few other medical mysteries had. The media was filled with sensational headlines, and the mystery began to grow into a nationwide obsession. The cause behind the poisoning remained unclear, but the unanswered questions only made the case more intriguing. Gloria's family, while still grieving her untimely death, found themselves the subject of intense public scrutiny. Their lives were turned upside down, and the pressure to explain what had happened to Gloria grew with each passing day. One of the most perplexing aspects of the case was the strange chemical reaction that occurred in Gloria's blood. As tests continued, the results painted an increasingly bizarre picture. Gloria's blood had contained unusual compounds, substances that should not have been there. It was almost as if her body had been a vessel for something far beyond what anyone had encountered before. Doctors couldn't explain the oily residue that had appeared in her blood. Toxicology reports came back with no clear answers. Some speculated that Gloria had been exposed to an industrial chemical that had somehow found its way into her bloodstream. But how could this happen without leaving a trace of contamination in her environment? There were no obvious signs of a chemical spill or any industrial exposure. The mystery deepened with every failed attempt at understanding what had caused the strange, poisonous reaction. It wasn't until several months later that a more alarming theory emerged. A small group of toxicologists began to wonder if Gloria had somehow become the victim of a rare and fatal poisoning, one so rare that it had been almost forgotten by modern science. They believed that Gloria had been exposed to a chemical substance that could be produced naturally in the body under extreme circumstances, a substance known as dimethylmercury. This was a highly toxic compound capable of causing extreme damage to the nervous system and triggering a series of physical reactions that would explain the symptoms witnessed in the IF that night. But even as this theory began to gain traction, there was no evidence linking Gloria to dimethylmercury exposure. The scientific community was divided. Could such an obscure substance have played a role in Gloria's death? Or was this just another desperate theory? As the investigation into Gloria's death dragged on, researchers became obsessed with finding a logical explanation. Some of them suggested that Gloria's exposure could have been accidental, perhaps through the use of some common household product that contained a hidden chemical compound. Others suspected that there might have been an intentional element to it. The possibility of foul play began to creep into the conversation. Had someone targeted Gloria? Was she exposed to a toxic substance by someone who intended to harm her? Was the tragedy of that night merely a case of a woman unknowingly poisoning herself? Or was there something more sinister at work? Meanwhile, the press continued to sensationalize the story, publishing dramatic headlines that only fueled the public's obsession with the case. Stories of the toxic E became urban legends in the making, each new article building on the last, until the mystery of Gloria Ramirez reached fever pitch. Yet for all the headlines and speculation, the truth remained elusive. With every theory that emerged, another layer of mystery was added. The scientific community was split, with experts offering contradictory opinions. Some believed Gloria had simply been the victim of a freak accident. Others were convinced that something far darker was at play. And as the story continued to unfold, it became clear that nobody could fully understand what had happened. Amidst the chaos, the Ramirez family remained in shock. They couldn't comprehend what had happened to Gloria. She had been a vibrant woman, full of life and potential. To think that something so inexplicable and terrifying had happened to her felt like a betrayal. They were left struggling to understand why this had happened to her, why she had to be at the center of something so horrifying. Miguel Ramirez, Gloria's brother, was particularly vocal about the torment his family had been subjected to. "My sister was not some science experiment," he said in one interview. "She was a person, and what happened to her wasn't just strange, it was cruel. No one should have to go through something like that." The pain of losing Gloria was compounded by the uncertainty surrounding her death. The lack of answers meant that the Ramirez family was constantly haunted by the question, could they have done something to save her? Was there a way to prevent the horrifying sequence of events that led to her death? And if Gloria hadn't died that night, what would have happened to the people who had been exposed to the same toxins? Would they have suffered a similar fate? The questions piled up, but there was no closure to be found. And as the months turned into years, the questions remained unanswered. Even in death, Gloria Ramirez became a symbol of the unknown. She represented the human vulnerability we all share, the fragility of life, and the terrifying unpredictability of illness. In a world where we often believe ourselves to be in control of our health and safety, Gloria's case was a stark reminder that the invisible dangers lurking in our environment are still very much beyond our understanding. There was no easy explanation, no satisfying conclusion. Gloria had become a mystery, a puzzle that no one could solve. Years later, when people talked about the toxic lady, they did so with an air of reverence. Her story had become folklore, a tale passed down through whispers and hushed tones. The mystery had grown far beyond her tragic death. Some said that Riverside General Hospital still had traces of her presence, that the strange, chemical smell could still be detected in the hallways during late-night shifts. Whether that was fact or fiction didn't matter. The legend of Gloria Ramirez would remain alive for as long as the memory of that night lived on. And yet, even as the years passed, the question remained, what happened to Gloria? Was it a tragic accident? A medical anomaly? Or was there something more to this story, something darker and more profound than anyone was willing to admit? As the years passed, Gloria Ramirez's case faded from the public's immediate memory. But for those directly affected by the incident, those who had been in the A that night, a mystery still loomed large. For Dr. Thomas Richards and the nurses who had been part of that fateful evening, the events of February 19, 1994, remained a haunting puzzle. They could not escape the memory of the toxic air, the smell of ammonia that had clung to their clothes and lingered in their nostrils, long after they had left the hospital. It was as though their minds had been marked by the event. No amount of therapy or time could erase the mental images of that chaotic night. The emotional scars left on the medical staff were as real as any physical injury, and the question of what had happened to Gloria seemed to follow them, unshakable. Dr. Richards, now several years removed from the event, often found himself reflecting on that night in the quiet moments of his work. His colleagues had moved on, but the case had left a lasting impact on him. His own physical symptoms, the dizziness, the weakness that had gripped him during the incident, still lingered. They weren't as intense as they had been, but they never truly went away. His mind often wandered to the idea that perhaps he had never fully recovered from the toxins that had filled the air that night. Was it possible that whatever had poisoned Gloria had also poisoned him and his colleagues, even if the blood tests showed nothing? The lingering doubt was maddening. As the investigation stalled and theories were tossed around like leaves in the wind, a few determined individuals began to make their own inquiries. Dr. Richards was one of them, but others joined him, including independent toxicologists, journalists, and even a few concerned citizens. They were not content to let the case fade into obscurity. They wanted answers. What had happened to Gloria Ramirez? Was she the victim of an accidental chemical exposure? Or had there been something far more sinister at play? Could she have been exposed to something that turned her into a walking time bomb, her body unwittingly releasing toxins into the air? And why had the hospital not found any evidence of such a substance? The unanswered questions hung over the case like an ever-growing shadow. One breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former lab technician who had worked at Riverside General during the time of the incident came forward with startling information. She had been part of the team that conducted the initial tests on Gloria's blood and had worked closely with the toxicology department. While she had never spoken out before, she claimed that the blood samples from Gloria had been handled differently from those of any other patient. There had been signs, she said, that the lab equipment had been compromised in some way, that the chemical residue found in the blood could have been the result of contamination during testing. But no one had ever investigated this possibility. The technician's revelations were explosive, but they were also a little too convenient. Could the answer to the mystery lie in a simple lab error? Or was there more to this story than met the eye? The technician's claims sparked a new round of investigations, but they only deepened the mystery. If the chemical compounds in Gloria's blood were the result of contamination, it raised even more questions about the hospital's protocols and the safety measures in place at Riverside General. Could something as basic as a laboratory oversight have caused the catastrophic events of that night? The idea seemed far-fetched, yet it couldn't be ruled out entirely. Medical experts and authorities scrambled to find any shred of evidence that would bring clarity to the situation. But with every new lead, the trail seemed to grow colder. Meanwhile, Gloria's family continued to grieve, but they also found themselves swept up in the growing wave of public interest. They had never wanted this spotlight, but now they were thrust into it. For Miguel Ramirez, the constant media attention was a painful reminder of the trauma his family had endured. He still struggled with the fact that Gloria's death had never been fully explained. He wanted answers, but he also feared what those answers might reveal. Had his sister really been the victim of a medical error, or was there something darker at play? He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was being hidden from the public, that someone or something was being protected. A few months later, in the quiet of a medical conference, Dr. Michael D. Smith, the toxicologist who had been one of the few to pursue the dimethyl mercury theory, made an announcement that reignited the flame of interest in the case. During a lecture on rare poisons, he casually mentioned Gloria Ramirez in passing, noting that her case could be an example of how toxins could work in unexpected ways. His statement was brief, almost offhand, but it caught the attention of the right people. A journalist named Sarah Preston, who had been following the case from the beginning, immediately reached out to Dr. Smith for an interview. She was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, and Dr. Smith was her key to unlocking it. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Dr. Smith worked together to dig deeper into Gloria's case. They examined the possibility of dimethylmercury poisoning once again, but they also began to consider other chemicals that might have had similar effects. What stood out to them was the presence of a particular chemical, one that had never been properly tested for in Gloria's blood. It was a compound found in a variety of industrial products, including pesticides and solvents, and it was known to cause extreme reactions in the human body. Could this chemical have been introduced into Gloria's system without anyone noticing? And if so, how? The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but they still didn't form a complete picture. At the same time, the hospital's staff continued to struggle with their own trauma. They had been the ones to witness the chaos that night, and many of them found it difficult to continue working in the same environment. Some left Riverside General, unable to cope with the memories. Others, like Dr. Richards, stayed on, but they were never the same. The hospital's reputation, once impeccable, had been damaged by the incident. Patients began to question the safety of the hospital, and the staff, once proud to wear their uniforms, now found themselves second-guessing their every move. Was it a fluke? Or was there something more insidious at play within the walls of Riverside General? The fear of the unknown began to gnaw at everyone involved in the case. The more Sarah and Dr. Smith uncovered, the more it seemed that the answers were being deliberately hidden. Could it be that the hospital had covered up the true cause of the incident? Could the powers that be have intentionally ignored a medical error, hoping that the whole thing would just fade into obscurity? And if so, what did they have to hide? Gloria's death was no longer just a tragedy. It was a political issue. The consequences of uncovering the truth were too great, and those in positions of power would do whatever they could to keep it buried. But Sarah was determined to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Her investigation, however, would take her down a path she never expected, a path that would lead her into the dark heart of the medical industry. As the investigation continued, a dark conclusion began to take shape. The mystery of Gloria Ramirez was not just a tragic accident, but part of something much larger, a hidden scandal that would affect countless lives. The truth would not be easy to uncover, and it was clear that there were powerful forces at play, working behind the scenes to ensure that the full story would never be told. As Sarah Preston's investigation into Gloria Ramirez's mysterious death deepened, she quickly realized that she was walking a thin line. Every step she took seemed to lead her into a web of secrecy, a tangled mess of suppressed truths and unsettling silence. The more she uncovered, the more it became apparent that the case of Gloria Ramirez wasn't simply an isolated incident. It was the tip of a much larger, more dangerous iceberg. What she had once thought was a tragic accident was quickly unraveling into a story of corporate negligence, medical malpractice, and a system that seemed more intent on covering up its mistakes than protecting the public. With each new lead, Sarah was forced to confront uncomfortable truths. She had initially believed that Gloria's case was the result of some rare medical anomaly, but as she dug deeper into the hospital's history, she began to notice patterns. Riverside General had been the site of several other strange incidents over the years, cases that had been quietly swept under the rug, their details hidden from the public. Was it possible that the hospital had a history of mishandling toxic substances, or worse, covering up unsafe practices? Could Gloria Ramirez have been just another casualty in a long line of medical mistakes that were never properly investigated? The more questions Sarah asked, the more she felt as though she was getting too close to something that powerful people wanted kept buried. Dr. Michael D. Smith, the toxicologist who had been helping Sarah, was also becoming increasingly uneasy. He had spent years researching rare poisons and chemicals, but he had never encountered anything quite like what happened to Gloria Ramirez. The more he read through the medical reports and lab results, the more confused he became. Gloria's blood, despite showing signs of chemical contamination, did not match any known poison or substance. But the toxicological reactions that occurred when she entered the emergency room were unmistakable. There was a force in her body, something invisible but powerful, that had affected everyone around her. It was as if her very presence had become a weapon, and no one could figure out how or why. One of the key pieces of the puzzle that Sarah uncovered came when she spoke with a former employee of Riverside General, a whistleblower who had worked in the hospital's maintenance department. This individual, who requested anonymity for fear of retribution, revealed that there had been ongoing issues with the hospital's ventilation system for years. According to the whistleblower, there had been reports of strange smells in the hospital's air ducts, an overpowering chemical odor that had been ignored by management. The ventilation system had been old and poorly maintained, with numerous complaints from staff about foul-smelling air that caused dizziness and nausea. The whistleblower claimed that the hospital had never taken these complaints seriously, and that any attempt to address the issue had been brushed aside as trivial. Could this malfunctioning system have been the source of the toxic air that filled the ER the night Gloria Ramirez was admitted? But the more Sarah investigated, the more layers of mystery she uncovered. She learned that the hospital had been part of a larger healthcare network that had been under scrutiny for its business practices. Several of the network's hospitals had been fined for safety violations, but Riverside General had somehow managed to avoid significant repercussions. There were rumors that the hospital had made deals with corporate sponsors to keep quiet about issues like poor air quality and inadequate safety measures. This corruption extended far beyond Gloria's case. It was a systematic failure of medical institutions that valued profit over patient safety. The fact that the hospital had a history of downplaying safety concerns made it harder to ignore the possibility that Gloria's death was not an isolated incident, but the result of a larger, more insidious pattern. As Sarah's investigation took her deeper into the heart of the medical industry, she discovered that Riverside General was not the only institution with a murky past. Several other hospitals within the same network had been cited for similar problems: poor air quality, improper handling of toxic substances, and unexplained patient illnesses. It seemed that there was a widespread issue with hospital safety that had been ignored for far too long. Gloria Ramirez had become a symbol of this larger problem, her death representing the culmination of years of neglect and poor management. But uncovering the truth was not going to be easy. Powerful people were invested in keeping the story quiet, and the deeper Sarah dug, the more resistance she encountered. Dr. Smith, who had initially been eager to help Sarah, was beginning to feel the pressure of the investigation as well. He had already put his career on the line by speaking out about Gloria's case. But as the investigation gained traction, he found himself being contacted by individuals who didn't want the story to go any further. Threatening phone calls began to arrive at his office, and anonymous emails filled with warnings and accusations flooded his inbox. Some even suggested that his involvement in the case could lead to severe consequences for his professional reputation. But Dr. Smith, who had dedicated his life to studying toxicology, could not turn away. He knew that the truth needed to come out, no matter the personal cost. As Sarah and Dr. Smith grew closer to uncovering the full scope of the scandal, they began to face increasingly dangerous obstacles. Their phones were tapped, their emails intercepted, and their movements were monitored by unknown individuals. It became clear that those in power were willing to do whatever it took to stop them from exposing the truth. Sarah was even followed by a black SUV one evening as she left a meeting with Dr. Smith. A chilling reminder that they were not just dealing with a medical mystery, they were up against a system that would go to any length to protect its interests. But even in the face of these threats, Sarah refused to back down. She knew that exposing the truth would be the only way to ensure that Gloria Ramirez's death was not in vain. The situation grew more tense as Sarah's investigation began to catch the attention of the press. A few journalists had begun to pick up on the story, and soon Gloria's case was making headlines once again. The public, once indifferent to her death, now began to demand answers. People were starting to see Gloria not just as a victim, but as a symbol of the flaws in the healthcare system. Her death had become a rallying cry for those who had long suspected that the medical industry was not as trustworthy as it seemed. The more the story spread, the more difficult it became for the hospital and the corporate sponsors behind it to maintain their silence. But the clock was ticking. As the media frenzy built, so did the pressure on Sarah and Dr. Smith. They knew that they had to act quickly before the powers that be found a way to shut them down permanently. The more information they uncovered, the closer they got to exposing the truth. But the question remained, would they be able to break through the barriers of corruption and secrecy before it was too late? Or would the shadow of Gloria Ramirez's death continue to loom over them, unanswered and unresolved? As the final pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, Sarah realized that what she had uncovered wasn't just a medical mystery, it was a wake-up call. The systems designed to protect the public had failed Gloria Ramirez, and they had failed countless others before her. But it wasn't just the hospital's negligence that had allowed her death to occur. It was the larger, systemic issues that had led to the cover-up. The fight for justice had become a fight against a deeply entrenched system, one that valued profit over patient care, and one that would go to extreme lengths to keep its secrets hidden. As Sarah and Dr. Smith pushed forward with their investigation, the walls began to close in around them. The deeper they dug into the events surrounding Gloria Ramirez's death, the more they realized that they were uncovering something far more sinister than they had ever anticipated. What had started as an inquiry into a medical mystery had transformed into a battle against a powerful and well-protected network, a system that had orchestrated cover-ups and silenced anyone brave enough to speak out. With each passing day, the forces working against them grew more aggressive, but Sarah's resolve was unshakable. She couldn't walk away now, not when the truth was so close. The tipping point came when Sarah received an anonymous tip from someone within the hospital network, an inside source who had been monitoring her investigation. The tip was a bombshell. It was confirmed that the toxicological samples from Gloria's blood had been deliberately altered. Someone within Riverside General had tampered with the lab results in an attempt to cover up the true cause of her poisoning. This was a turning point in Sarah's investigation. It wasn't just negligence or an oversight. It was an intentional effort to hide the truth. The conspiracy went far deeper than anyone had realized. With this new piece of evidence, Sarah's focus shifted. It was no longer just about the cause of Gloria's illness. It was about exposing a system that had repeatedly placed profits over patient safety. Riverside General and its parent company had engaged in a deliberate cover-up, not only in Gloria's case, but in countless others. The tampering of medical records and lab results was just one part of a larger pattern of misconduct, a calculated attempt to protect the hospital's reputation and the corporate interests behind it. The ramifications of this discovery were far-reaching. If they could prove that the hospital had intentionally falsified medical data, it would open the door to a wave of legal action that could bring the entire healthcare network to its knees. Sarah was now in a race against time. As the story gained traction in the media, the hospital network's response was swift and brutal. Legal teams were deployed, and attempts to intimidate Sarah escalated. Threatening phone calls, emails, and even physical surveillance became part of her daily routine. It was clear that the forces behind the cover-up were willing to go to any lengths to protect their secrets. But Sarah, driven by her own personal commitment to justice, refused to back down. She knew that exposing the truth would not only vindicate Gloria Ramirez, but also reveal the extent of the corruption within the healthcare system. The pressure began to take its toll on Sarah. She had always prided herself on her professional detachment. But now, as the investigation became increasingly personal, she found herself questioning everything. The constant fear of retaliation, the threat of losing her job, and the emotional weight of Gloria's death all began to weigh heavily on her. Yet, in the quiet moments when the weight of it all seemed unbearable, Sarah would remember why she started this journey. It wasn't just about the mystery of Gloria Ramirez's death. It was about giving a voice to those who had been silenced by a system that prioritized money over lives. In an attempt to gather more evidence, Sarah and Dr. Smith approached former hospital staff who had worked closely with Gloria during her time at Riverside General. One of the key witnesses was a nurse named Jessica Lawson, who had been one of the first to treat Gloria in the emergency room. Jessica had been one of the nurses who had fainted in the midst of the chaos and had never spoken about the incident publicly. After a series of tense interviews, Jessica revealed details that would change the course of the investigation. She described a strange encounter she had witnessed just days before Gloria's admission to the hospital. According to Jessica, she had overheard a conversation between two hospital administrators discussing a cleanup of toxic materials on the hospital's property. The conversation had been cryptic, but Jessica's intuition told her that it was related to the chemicals that ultimately poisoned Gloria and the medical staff. Jessica's testimony was crucial. It suggested that the cover-up extended far beyond tampering with lab results. There had been an attempt to hide evidence of hazardous substances within the hospital itself. The cleanup effort mentioned in the conversation was likely an attempt to cover up a larger environmental hazard that had been ignored for years. This new lead reinforced the idea that the hospital's negligence was systemic, that it wasn't just a one-off mistake, but a deliberate effort to conceal a long-standing problem. As Sarah pieced together the information from Jessica and other sources, the full extent of the conspiracy began to emerge. Riverside General and the larger healthcare network had been aware of serious safety issues for years, but they had chosen to ignore them in favor of profit. Gloria Ramirez's case was not an isolated event. It was the product of a larger system of medical malpractice, corporate greed, and indifference to patient well-being. This revelation struck Sarah with the force of a freight train. She realized that Gloria had been the victim of a much broader tragedy, one that had been ignored for far too long. With this new understanding, Sarah and Dr. Smith worked together to compile their findings. They knew that exposing the truth would require more than just a handful of witnesses. It would require hard evidence, a clear connection between the hospital's negligence and Gloria's poisoning. They began to target key documents and internal reports that had been hidden away for years. Slowly but surely, they uncovered more evidence of the hospital's involvement in covering up the environmental hazards that had led to Gloria's exposure to toxic chemicals. It was a slow process, but each new discovery added another layer to the story. Despite the mounting evidence, the hospital's legal team continued to push back. They tried to discredit Sarah and Dr. Smith, claiming that they were exaggerating the facts and distorting the truth. The smear campaign against them grew more aggressive with each passing week. But Sarah remained undeterred. She knew that the only way to get justice for Gloria was to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. It wasn't just about Gloria anymore. It was about exposing the rot at the heart of the healthcare industry. As the investigation reached its final stages, the legal battle intensified. Riverside General's parent company filed multiple lawsuits against Sarah, Dr. Smith, and any journalist who dared to report on the story. The stakes had never been higher, but with the evidence they had gathered, Sarah and Dr. Smith knew they had a chance to finally bring the truth to the public. The fight wasn't just for Gloria, it was for every patient who had been harmed by a system that valued profits over lives. Finally, in a courtroom filled with tension and anticipation, Sarah and Dr. Smith presented their findings. The truth was undeniable. Riverside General had been complicit in the cover-up of toxic exposure, and Gloria Ramirez had paid the ultimate price. The court ruled in favor of the victims, forcing the hospital to pay millions in restitution and hold those responsible accountable. It was a hard-fought victory, one that came with a heavy toll, But it was also a testament to the power of persistence, courage, and the unwavering belief that truth and justice would prevail. The victory, however, came with mixed emotions. Sarah knew that Gloria Ramirez's death would never be fully explained, but the legal ruling had ensured that her story would be remembered. Gloria had become a symbol of the flaws in a healthcare system that had prioritized money over patient safety, and her death had sparked a movement that would lead to reforms in hospitals nationwide. The victory, though hard-earned, would be bittersweet. Gloria's life had been stolen by the system, but in the end, her death had sparked a change that would hopefully prevent others from suffering the same fate. As the dust settled from the legal battle that had gripped the country, the story of Gloria Ramirez, the toxic lady, was far from over. While the court ruling provided some semblance of justice, it didn't bring back the woman whose tragic death had sparked a nationwide conversation about hospital safety, corporate negligence, and the hidden dangers lurking in the very systems meant to protect us. In the aftermath, Gloria's case became a case study, a cautionary tale that highlighted the deep-rooted flaws in the healthcare industry. It was a story that changed lives and reshaped the conversation about patient safety forever. For Sarah Preston, the journalist who had doggedly pursued the truth, the victory felt bittersweet. The court case had been a grueling process, and the toll it had taken on her both personally and professionally was immense. But in the end, it was worth it. The truth had been exposed, and the system had been held accountable. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Despite the legal victory, she had never truly found the answers she had been searching for. The mystery of what exactly happened that night in Riverside General's emergency room had never been fully explained, and it continued to haunt her. Gloria's death may have been part of a larger scandal, but Sarah couldn't help but wonder, was there a deeper, more dangerous truth still out there? For Dr. Michael D. Smith, the toxicologist who had helped uncover the key evidence, the case was both a personal triumph and a professional challenge. As someone who had spent his life studying poisons and chemicals, he had never encountered anything like what had happened to Gloria. The toxicological reactions, the mysterious residue in her blood, and the way it affected everyone around her, it was unlike anything he had ever seen in his decades of research. Even with the court's ruling, the scientific community still didn't have all the answers. Was it the work of an unknown toxin? Or was it something else entirely? Theories continued to circulate in medical circles, but Dr. Smith knew that some questions might never be fully answered. The case had pushed the boundaries of toxicology and medical science in ways that no one could have predicted. But for the Ramirez family, the legal victory and public acknowledgement of their sister's case brought only partial comfort. The wounds of losing Gloria, so suddenly, so violently, remained fresh. Miguel Ramirez, Gloria's brother, had spent years trying to make sense of his sister's death. The weight of the mystery had been almost unbearable for him. He had watched as Gloria's life was cut short, only for the truth to be obscured by the very system that was meant to protect her. Even though the hospital had been held accountable, Miguel couldn't help but feel a deep sense of anger and loss. The hospital had failed his sister, and the system had allowed it to happen. No amount of legal restitution could bring her back. For the public, the case had served as a stark reminder of the flaws in the healthcare system. The tragedy of Gloria Ramirez had exposed the hidden dangers lurking within hospitals across the country: dangerous chemicals, neglected safety protocols, and the corporate greed that placed profits over patient care. The outcry from the public following the court ruling led to widespread calls for reforms. There were demands for more stringent safety regulations, for better oversight of hospital practices, and for more transparency in the way medical institutions operated. It was a long overdue reckoning for an industry that had long been shielded from scrutiny. Gloria's death, however, was not a singular event. It was a tragic chapter in a much larger narrative, one that had been unfolding for years, but had been largely ignored by the public. The toxic hazards in hospitals were not new, but they had been swept under the rug for far too long. Gloria's case was the catalyst that exposed this uncomfortable reality. Her story forced society to confront the fact that hospitals, places where people should feel safe, were themselves vulnerable to the same kind of neglect and oversight that could harm those they were meant to protect. For many, Gloria Ramirez became the symbol of this hidden crisis, a reminder that even the most trusted institutions can fail. The legal fallout from the case extended far beyond Riverside General. As more victims of hospital negligence came forward, the scope of the scandal expanded. Lawsuits piled up against various healthcare providers, leading to broader reforms in medical safety and accountability. Hospitals began to review their safety protocols, conduct more thorough inspections, and implement new policies to protect both patients and staff from harm. The medical industry, which had long been insulated from scrutiny, now found itself under a microscope. Gloria's case had made sure of that. But even with the reforms and the attention that the case had garnered, there were still lingering questions about what had actually happened to Gloria. Was it really a case of industrial poisoning? Or was there something else at play? The evidence suggested that Gloria had somehow been exposed to a toxic substance, but no one could ever definitively identify the chemical responsible. It was a terrifying thought, the possibility that there could be dangerous substances lurking in our environments, invisible to the naked eye, waiting for the right conditions to cause harm. For those involved in the case, the uncertainty about what had truly happened that night would never go away. As the years passed, the memory of Gloria Ramirez's death became part of the collective consciousness. Her name became synonymous with hospital safety, a tragic reminder of the vulnerabilities we all face. Her case was included in medical textbooks, studied by future generations of doctors and researchers as a cautionary tale. Her death had sparked a movement that led to tangible changes in the healthcare industry. But the full story of what happened that night in Riverside General SA was never fully known. It remained a mystery, an unanswered question that would continue to haunt those who had been involved in the case. The case of Gloria Ramirez, the toxic lady, remains an enduring mystery in the annals of medical history. It serves as both a warning and a call to action. Despite the efforts to find answers, the truth may never be fully uncovered. Yet, the fight for justice, driven by the tenacity of those who refuse to let Gloria's death be in vain, has led to real change. The system has been forced to confront its shortcomings, and patients have been made aware of the dangers lurking in the places they trust most. Gloria's story is not just a tale of one woman's death, it's the story of an industry that was forced to reckon with its own failings. Her death will never be forgotten, and her legacy will continue to shape the way hospitals operate for generations to come. And so, the mystery of Gloria Ramirez remains, both a puzzle and a symbol, her story etched into the collective memory. Her name will never be forgotten, nor will the tragedy that unfolded on that cold night in February 1994.